The morning had started like every other Thursday in the Oak Ridge subdivision. Manicured lawns, silent streets, the kind of neighborhood where people kept their problems behind closed doors and their emotions behind polite smiles. Margaret Chen had lived here for 17 years, and she'd perfected the mask. But today, September 14th at 10:47 a.m., the mask was about to shatter. It had begun 3 weeks earlier when the developers broke ground on the Hendersons' vacant lot next door. Margaret had known it was coming. Everyone did, but knowing and watching were different things. She stood in her kitchen, coffee growing cold in her hands, watching through the window as the cement truck backed into the driveway. This was supposed to be the final straw, the luxury townhouse development that would change everything about the character of Oak Ridge. 7 units crammed into what had been an empty field for a decade. 35 parking spaces, 3 stories of modern glass and steel, nothing like the established brick colonials and well-maintained ranches that lined the street. Mom, her daughter Lily's voice cut through her thoughts. 16-year-old Lily stood in the kitchen doorway, backpack slung over one shoulder, her phone already in her hand. I'm going to Myra's after school, okay? Margaret didn't look away from the window. How's the college application going? Fine, Mom, the car. You're not driving my car. It needs new brake pads. But Sarah gets to use her mom's car every day, and I'm not Sarah's mother, and Oak Ridge High is walking distance anyway. Lily made a sound between a sigh and a groan, the universal teenage expression of parental incomprehension. She left without another word, and Margaret heard the front door close a moment later. She wondered when exactly she'd become the kind of mother her daughter couldn't talk to. When had it happened? Was there a specific moment, or had it been gradual, a slow erosion like water on stone? Margaret set down her coffee and moved to the sink, washing her hands with the meticulousness of someone who needed to feel in control of something. The water was hot, almost burning. She liked it that way. Her husband David would be home late. He always was. His firm had promoted him to senior vice president 2 years ago, and the promotion meant he was out 5 nights a week, usually with clients, sometimes with the team, a phrase that had become increasingly vague over the last 6 months. Margaret had stopped asking questions. What was the point? They'd settled into a rhythm of polite distance, ships passing in a house they'd paid off years ago but never really made a home. She looked around her kitchen, the granite countertops they'd installed in 2015, the stainless steel appliances that gleamed like trophies, the tasteful gray backsplash chosen from 3 expensive options, and felt nothing. Not pride, not satisfaction, just a hollow echo of the life she'd thought she was building. The construction noise was already starting. The beeping of the truck backing up, shouted instructions between workers, the terrible mechanical screech of equipment being positioned. Margaret could feel her jaw tightening, could feel the familiar pressure building behind her eyes. She had a dental appointment at 1 o'clock, a routine cleaning. She'd been dreading it all week. By 11:30 a.m., Margaret had spiraled through 3 hours' worth of emails, scrolling through the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association Facebook group where other residents were already posting about the construction noise, the dust, the parking situation, the character concerns. She read Linda Rothman's post about how this kind of development attracts a different element. She read Patricia Wu's comment about property values. She read Marcus and Jennifer's thread about filing a noise complaint with the town. Nobody had mentioned the real problem, though. Nobody ever did. Because the real problem was that they were all getting older and their world was shrinking and something was being built in the margins and they couldn't stop it, and that terrified them. Margaret's phone buzzed, a text from her mother. Mom, text, haven't heard from you in 3 weeks, I'm worried. She stared at the message. 3 weeks. Had it really been that long? She tried to think of the last time she'd called. Nothing came to mind. Her mother lived 45 minutes away in an assisted living facility since her father's stroke last year. Margaret had been meaning to visit. She'd been meaning to a lot of things. She didn't text back. Instead, she did something she rarely allowed herself to do. She opened Facebook on her personal account and scrolled through her own timeline. Pictures of other people's lives. Birthday parties with balloons, vacations at the beach, new homes, engaged couples, bobbies. The highlight reel of human existence, each image a small claim of happiness, achievement, normalcy. She found her own last posted photo. It was from Easter 6 months ago. Her in a blue dress, not the same blue dress, a different one, smiling at the camera with David and Lily outside their front door. The family picture, the family that looked happy. Margaret had 847 Facebook friends. She was fairly certain she couldn't name 400 of them. The construction noise was getting louder. She could see the shadow of the cement truck through the kitchen window, could hear the driver yelling at someone to watch the fence. The fence. The beautiful wrought iron fence that David had insisted they install 5 years ago, that had cost $8,000, that was apparently now in danger of being damaged by contractors who didn't care about anyone's property but their own. Something was building inside Margaret, too, something darker than worry, more urgent than sadness. It felt like pressure, like a balloon being inflated past its safe capacity. She grabbed her phone and called Dr. Stevens' office to reschedule her cleaning. "I'm so sorry," the receptionist said, "but we have a cancellation fee for appointments canceled within 24 hours. Margaret hung up. At 12:30 p.m., she was in her car, driving toward the construction site. She didn't remember making the decision to do this. It was as if her body had simply decided for her, to drive, to confront, to demand explanations from people who wouldn't understand what it meant that everything was changing. The construction supervisor was a man named Garrett. She found out his name by walking straight across the muddy lot and asking. He was in his mid-50s, with a weathered face and a clipboard, the kind of man who'd been doing this job for 30 years and had probably heard every complaint possible. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back," he said, his voice professionally neutral. "This is an active construction site." "I'm a resident," Margaret said. She sounded rational, she thought. That was good. She was still in control. "I live next door. I need to know about the hours of operation and the noise ordinance violations." "The permits are all filed with the town," Garrett said. He wasn't even looking at her anymore. He was looking past her at something on the site. "If you have concerns, you can file a complaint with." "With who? Who do I complain to when nobody listens? When everything just happens whether you want it to or not?" She realized she'd said that too loudly. Garrett glanced back at her, and his expression had shifted into the careful neutrality of someone dealing with a potentially unstable person. "Ma'am, if you need to discuss this further, you'll need to contact the development company. Our office is." "I know where your office is. I've been researching you for 3 weeks. You cut corners on the Henderson site, you got a noise violation on Riverside Avenue, and you've been sued twice for property damage." "That's not," Garrett set down his clipboard. "Look, we follow all the regulations. If you have a problem, you can call the town, but I can't help you right now. I've got to get back to work." He turned away from her. That was the moment, the turning point where Margaret felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, a seismic movement from the basement of her consciousness up into the light. He had dismissed her. This man, this stranger, had literally turned away from her while she was speaking. She thought about her mother's text, about Lily's sigh, about David saying 3 months ago over dinner, "Maybe you should find more to do, you seem unhappy." As if her unhappiness was a personal failing. As if she hadn't dedicated 17 years to maintaining this perfect house in this perfect neighborhood while the life she'd planned quietly disappeared, while the people she loved slowly stopped seeing her, while she became invisible in her own existence. "Excuse-me," Margaret's voice cracked like a whip. "I am talking to you." Garrett stopped, turned back slowly, and that's when she saw it, the moment he looked at her and decided she was crazy. The moment her words became the rant, the incident, the story that would be told later at construction site meetings and in neighborhood group chats. That was when she saw the camera. It was mounted on the corner of the foundation, one of those security cameras that the development company had installed to monitor the site. It was pointed directly at her. She had been captured. "Do you know what's wrong with you?" Margaret heard herself saying, her voice steady now, almost eerily calm. "It's not just you. It's all of you. You come in here, you destroy things, you tell us it's progress, and we're just supposed to accept it. We're supposed to smile and move forward and pretend like something hasn't been taken from us, like we don't matter." Garrett was backing away now, one hand up in a placating gesture. "And the worst part," Margaret continued, "is that I let it happen. I let it all happen. I let them tell me that if I just worked hard enough, if I just made the right choices, if I just stayed in my lane and did what I was supposed to do, then everything would be okay. But it's not okay. None of it is okay." Her voice had risen. Workers had stopped what they were doing. Neighbors had appeared on their porches to look. Someone was filming with their phone. "You think you're better than me?" Margaret said, and now tears were streaming down her face, and she wasn't sure if she was talking to Garrett anymore, or to David, or to her mother, or to herself. You think your perfect little development, your 7 little houses that nobody needs, means you can just come here and erase everything. Erase who we are. Erase. She couldn't finish. The pressure had finally broken, and she was sobbing, standing in the mud in her designer yoga pants and her monogrammed sweater, surrounded by strangers' eyes, undone. That was the rant. That was the moment. 47 seconds of Margaret Chen, age 43, completely and utterly breaking down in front of a security camera that would capture every tear, every gesture, every desperate word. Garrett said something into his radio. Within 5 minutes, a police car appeared, not to help her, to remove her. By 2:47 p.m., the video had been shared 847 times on Facebook. By 3:15 p.m., it had been reposted to 3 neighborhood apps. By 4:30 p.m., it was on Reddit. By 6:00 p.m., Margaret's face was being screenshotted and turned into memes. The comments started, "Why is she so crazy? This is what happens when suburban moms get too bored. She clearly has mental health issues. They need to keep her away from the neighborhood. She threatened him though, right? That's concerning. Just a Karen being a Karen, lol. I live there too, and honestly she's right, but also don't have a breakdown on camera. Her poor family is probably thrilled. She's making a scene on social media. I would move if I were them." By the time David came home at 7:30 p.m., the video had been viewed over 50,000 times. Margaret was sitting in the dark living room when she heard his car in the driveway. She heard him come inside, heard him pause in the foyer, that moment of confusion where he sensed something was wrong but couldn't quite place it. She heard him set down his briefcase. "Margaret, you home?" She didn't answer. She heard him walking through the house, looking for her. It would take him approximately 3 minutes to find her in the dark living room, sitting on the couch, and another 30 seconds to find the video on his phone. Someone from his office had already texted him with a laughing emoji and a message. "Is this your wife?" When David turned on the light and saw her face, she watched something happen in his eyes. A calculation, a reorganization of priorities, a sudden understanding that the life they'd constructed was more fragile than he'd realized. "Margaret," he said carefully, as if addressing someone he didn't quite recognize, "what happened?" And in that moment, as she watched her husband's careful expression, Margaret understood. Her rant had consequences, but not in the way she'd expected. The consequences were only just beginning. The local news station had picked up the story, running it on the 6 and 11 o'clock segments with the headline, "Suburban Woman's Construction Site Outburst Goes Viral." They'd interviewed Garrett from the construction company, who spoke in measured, sympathetic tones about how upset residents sometimes struggle with change, and how the company was committed to working with the community. They'd interviewed Linda Rothman from the HOA, who expressed concern about the stability of individuals in our neighborhood, and quickly pivoted to talking about the importance of conflict resolution resources. Nobody had interviewed Margaret. She hadn't slept. She'd sat in the dark living room all night while David had made calls, then stopped making calls, then sat silently beside her without speaking. By 3 a.m., she'd Googled her own name and disappeared into a rabbit hole of her own viral fame. By 5 a.m., she'd found Reddit threads with 2,000+ comments. By 7 a.m., she discovered that someone had created a Twitter account at Oak Ridge Rant and was running a parody account pretending to be her, making jokes about property values and yoga pants and unstable Karens. Lily had texted her at 6:30 a.m. "Mom, people are talking about the video at school. Can we please talk about this?" Margaret had stared at the message for 5 minutes before responding, "I'm sorry." That was all she could manage. By 8:15 a.m., she'd received 3 emails. The first was from the HOA president, a woman named Susan Graham, requesting that Margaret refrain from making additional public statements and suggesting that she consider taking some time away from community activities. The second was from her dentist's office, politely informing her that they would not be rescheduling her appointment and that she would still be charged the cancellation fee. The third was from a woman named Rachel Hoffman, who described herself as a communications consultant and reputation management specialist, offering to help Margaret Control the narrative for a fee of $3,000 for an initial consultation. Margaret deleted all 3 emails without responding. By 9:00 a.m., she'd received 12 phone calls from numbers she didn't recognize. She turned off her phone. David had already left for work. He'd kissed her on the forehead before leaving, a gesture that felt like both a blessing and a farewell. He hadn't said much beyond, "I have to go in. I'll call you later." She suspected he was already formulating his own strategy, already thinking about damage control for his career. Margaret had always been good at reading him, at understanding what he wasn't saying. In his silence this morning, she'd heard, "I need you to fix this. I need you to make this go away. I need you to not be a problem." At 9:30 a.m., her mother called from the assisted living facility. "Margaret, sweetie, I just saw a video on Facebook. Is that really you?" Margaret felt something crack inside her again, and she was crying, and her mother was asking questions, and Margaret was explaining, and the story was tumbling out, all of it. The construction site, David, Lily, the mask that had finally fallen, the years of pretending to be fine. Her mother listened. That's what her mother did. She listened the way David hadn't, the way Lily couldn't, the way Margaret had stopped allowing herself to do for anyone else. "Baby," her mother said when Margaret finally quieted, "I'm so proud of you." "Proud?" Margaret laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Mom, I had a complete breakdown on camera. I'm a meme. Lily's school friends are mocking me. I'm probably going to lose. I don't even know what I'm going to lose." "You lost something far more important than any of that a long time ago," her mother said. "You lost yourself, and I watched it happen, and I should have said something. But I did try. Do you remember? I kept saying, 'Margaret, you need to talk about how you feel,' and you kept saying, 'I'm fine, Mom.' And now you're finally not fine. You're finally real." Margaret had no response to that. She sat with the phone against her ear while her mother breathed on the other end of the line. "I love you," her mother said, "and I'm coming to see you this Saturday, and we're going to have lunch, and you're going to tell me everything, and then we're going to figure out what happens next." After they hung up, Margaret sat in the silence of her empty house and realized that she couldn't remember the last time her mother had said she was proud of her. Years, maybe decades. At 2:00 p.m., there was a knock on the door. Margaret almost didn't answer it. She was sitting in the kitchen, picking at a sandwich she had no appetite for when she heard the knock, 3 sharp raps. Official. It was a woman in her late 40s, wearing business casual and carrying a leather portfolio. Behind her was a man in his 60s with kind eyes and a concerned expression. "Mrs. Chen," the woman said, "I'm Patricia Wei from the town manager's office. This is Dr. Robert Patterson, a community mediator. We were hoping to speak with you about what happened yesterday." Margaret's stomach dropped. She thought about lawyers, about lawsuits, about whether she needed to call someone before speaking to these people. "Can I help you?" she said instead. "May we come in?" Patricia asked. Margaret stepped back and they entered the house, her perfect house, with its perfect furnishings and its empty rooms where nothing real ever happened. They sat in the living room and Patricia placed a folder on the coffee table. "We've reviewed the security footage," Patricia said, "and we've also reviewed the development permits, the noise ordinance regulations, and the construction timeline for the Hendersons' lot. I want to be frank with you, Mrs. Chen. What you said yesterday about the development cutting corners about the previous violations was accurate, and the way it came out was concerning to people, but the content itself raised some real questions." Margaret sat very still. "The development company," Patricia continued, "has been operating just barely within legal parameters. Our office has received 47 noise complaints in the past 3 weeks. The company was supposed to provide more community input before breaking ground, and they didn't. By strict legal standards, they've done nothing wrong, but by community standards, by standards of respect and consideration, they've been negligent." Dr. Patterson leaned forward. "What you expressed yesterday, the frustration, the fear about change, the sense of not being heard, that resonates with a lot of people in this neighborhood. But because it came out as a breakdown, it's being framed as a personal problem rather than a legitimate community concern." "So what are you saying?" Margaret asked. "We're saying," Patricia said, "that if you wanted to, you could fight back, not like this, like this." She tapped the folder. "We've been reviewing the permits. The company didn't get proper approval for the scale of the project, and there's a state law about community notification requirements that they skipped. You have grounds to challenge this development." Margaret felt something shift in her chest. Not hope exactly, something more complicated than that, a sense of agency, of power, of having been heard. What would I have to do? She asked. You'd have to file an official complaint with the town zoning board, Dr. Patterson said. You'd have to be willing to stand up and explain your concerns, rationally, clearly documented. You'd have to get other residents to support you, and you'd have to be willing to fight. And the video, Margaret asked, the rant. The video is what happened when you finally broke, Patricia said with unexpected gentleness. If you reframe it, not as a Karen having a fit, but as a community member pushed past her breaking point by an irresponsible corporation, then maybe the narrative changes. Maybe people remember that you were trying to be heard for weeks and nobody listened, and yesterday was what happens to human beings when they're not listened to. Patricia stood up. Dr. Patterson handed Margaret a business card. Think about it, Patricia said. You have 30 days to file a formal objection before the next development phase is approved, but you need to move quickly. After they left, Margaret sat in her living room for a long time, holding the business card, considering what it might mean to fight back. At 4:15 p.m., Lily came home from school. Margaret heard the door open, heard the sound of her daughter's backpack hitting the floor, heard her footsteps heading toward the stairs. She called out, "Lily, can we talk?" There was a pause. Then Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, expression somewhere between defensive and devastated. "Everyone's been awful," Lily said immediately. "They've been showing me the video, making jokes about you. Sarah said her mom said you should probably get mental help, and I didn't know what to say because I don't know what to say because my mom just had a breakdown on the internet." Margaret gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit." Lily sat, but she didn't unwind. She perched on the edge of the chair, ready to flee. "I owe you an explanation," Margaret said. "Not an excuse, an explanation." She told Lily about the construction site. But more than that, she told Lily the truth, about feeling invisible in her own life, about the years of pretending everything was fine when it wasn't, about not knowing how to talk to her daughter because she'd stopped knowing how to be authentic with anyone. She told Lily about David, about the distance that had grown between them, about the choices Margaret had made to be a good wife and a good mother, while losing sight of being a good person to herself. Lily listened with the expression of someone hearing confessions for the first time, surprise mixed with recognition, as if the pieces of a puzzle she'd been looking at for years had suddenly rearranged into clarity. "So you just broke," Lily said finally. "I just broke," Margaret confirmed. "And I'm sorry that it happened publicly. I'm sorry that you're experiencing the fallout, but I'm not sorry that it happened. Does that make sense?" Lily was quiet for a long moment. Then, "That actually kind of makes sense." "How are you feeling about everything?" Margaret asked. "Honestly, angry, embarrassed, but also mad at them for being so mean about it." Lily picked at her fingernail. "Like, yeah, the video is weird and you were losing it, but they're treating you like you're some kind of villain, and you're just like my mom, you're just a person who got really upset." Margaret reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. Lily didn't pull away. "I'm going to try to fix this," Margaret said. "Not by hiding, by fighting, by being loud about what happened and why it happened. I don't know if it'll work, but I'm going to try. And I want you to know that I'm going to be more present. I'm going to try to be someone you can actually talk to." "Okay," Lily said, and then, "Can I tell my friends that you're not crazy?" "You can tell them I'm working on it," Margaret smiled sadly. "But I'm not sure it'll help." "Yeah," Lily agreed, "probably not." But when Lily squeezed her hand before letting go, Margaret felt something like redemption. Not forgiveness, that would take time, but connection. The sense that there was still something real underneath the mask they'd both been wearing. At 7:30 p.m., David came home. He found Margaret in his office, sitting at his desk, with her laptop open to the zoning board regulations, and Patricia Way's business card placed carefully in front of her. "I'm going to file a formal objection," Margaret told him before he could even set down his briefcase. "To the development. There are legitimate regulatory violations. Patricia Way from the town manager's office came by and explained everything. This isn't just about me having a breakdown. This is about a company that didn't follow the rules and a community that got hurt because of it." David's expression cycled through surprise, concern, calculation, and finally, something she almost didn't recognize: relief. "Okay," he said slowly. "That's good, that's actually good." "Is it?" Margaret asked. Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like you were hopping I'd just hide and make this go away. I was, David admitted. He sat down in the chair across from his desk. I was hoping this would just become yesterday's news and everyone would move on. I was thinking about my career, about our reputation. I was thinking about all the wrong things. He looked at her, really looked at her, the way she'd been waiting for him to look at her for years. I got a call today, David said, from my mother. She told me that she saw the video and that I needed to listen to what you actually said underneath the emotion. And I listened to it, really listened. And Margaret, you were right, you were absolutely right. And the only person who wasn't listening was me. Margaret felt something in her chest loosen slightly. I think I need to see a therapist, David said. I think we probably both do, and I think I need to stop pretending that I'm too busy to know what's happening in my own life, in my own marriage. Is that what you want? Margaret asked carefully. Or is that what you think you're supposed to say right now? I don't know yet, David said honestly. But I think I want to find out, and I think that starts with telling you the truth instead of protecting myself. So let me start. I was miserable too. I've been miserable for a long time, and I think I was using work as an excuse to not have to be present for any of it. He reached over and took her hand, the same gesture Margaret had made with Lily an hour earlier. The same gesture of connection, of wanting to be seen. I'm sorry, David said. I'm sorry I didn't listen. I'm sorry I made you feel invisible. Margaret squeezed his hand and didn't let go. The zoning board meeting was scheduled for September 28th, 2 weeks after the viral video. Margaret spent those 2 weeks doing something she'd rarely done before. She fought. She filed the formal objection with the town zoning board on September 17th, citing 7 specific regulatory violations. She gathered documentation, building permits, noise ordinance records, community notification requirements from the state. She reached out to other residents in Oak Ridge, and she was surprised to find that while some didn't want to be associated with the Rant lady, at least 30 others were furious about the development and grateful that someone was finally doing something. They started meeting in Margaret's living room on Tuesday nights. It was a small group at first, 5 people, then 8, then 12. A retired teacher named George who had been documenting the noise violations for weeks. A young couple, Marcus and Jen, who were devastated about the development destroying what they saw as their investment neighborhood. Patricia Wu, the woman who had posted about property values on Facebook, though she was quieter about her motivations in person. And Linda Rothman, the HOA president who had surprised Margaret by reaching out privately. I said some stupid things on Facebook. I'd like to help. They worked together. George created a presentation with sound measurements and timeline documentation. Marcus and Jen produced a packet about zoning law violations. Patricia researched state regulations. Linda coordinated outreach to neighborhood residents. And Margaret wrote a statement, not emotional, not like the Rant, but clear-eyed and detailed and painful in its honesty about what happens when a community's voice is ignored. She also did something else. She gave interviews. The first one was with a local news station. The second reporter who approached her asked, "Would you be willing to talk about what happened and about the regulatory issues?" Margaret said yes. She sat in a professional blazer, her hair carefully done, and she spoke clearly and rationally about the development process, the failures of notification, the community concerns. She didn't hide the Rant, she acknowledged it, but she framed it. I regret the way I expressed myself that day. But I don't regret the content of what I was saying. A community is supposed to have a voice in the decisions that affect it. And when that voice is ignored, it builds pressure. It builds resentment. And eventually, it builds a breaking point. What you saw was my breaking point, but I'm going to make sure it's not in vain. The interview aired on September 24th. The response was different this time. Some people were sympathetic. Wow, she's actually making sense. I thought she was crazy. Others were defensive. She's just trying to spin her crazy breakdown into some kind of noble cause. But there was a shift in the conversation. The narrative was becoming more complex. Margaret wasn't just the Rant lady anymore. She was the Rant lady who followed up. By September 27th, the night before the zoning board meeting, Margaret's living room was filled with 43 people. The furniture had been pushed to the sides. Someone had brought coffee and cookies. George was running through the presentation one more time. Marcus and Jen were organizing the documentation packets. Patricia was doing sound checks for the audio clips they were going to play, the construction noise, the missed notification requirements. And Margaret stood in the corner watching it all happen and realized that she'd created something. Not just a fight against a development, but a community. A real one, not the performative kind where everyone smiled and kept their distance. Lily was there too. She'd asked if she could come, if she could help. Margaret had said yes without hesitation. Now her daughter was helping distribute packets, and she had this expression on her face, pride, maybe, or solidarity. Margaret wasn't entirely sure, but her daughter was there, was choosing to be there, and that was something. David had wanted to come too, but Margaret had asked him not to. "This is my fight," she'd said, "but I need to know you're home. I need to know that when I come home after this, you're going to be there and we're going to talk about it." He'd agreed, and Margaret believed him. The zoning board meeting was held at the town hall in the meeting room on the second floor. The room had a capacity of about 150 people, and Margaret's heart sank when she realized that it was going to be completely full. The development company had brought people. The architect was there, the project manager, several lawyers, and residents, but not Oak Ridge residents. People from the neighboring developments, who had an interest in seeing the project succeed, because it would increase property values across the whole area. The board itself consisted of 5 people. Chairman Robert Torres, who had a reputation for being pragmatic. Jessica Liu, who was a former environmental lawyer. Dale Patterson, who had lived in Oak Ridge for 20 years. Susan Goldman, who was new to the board. And Marcus Webb, who had significant financial interests in real estate development. Patricia Way had warned Margaret about Marcus Webb. "He's a problem," she'd said, "but there's not much we can do about that except present a really strong case." The development company went first, presenting their project with sleek slides and professional language. They talked about the economic benefits, construction jobs, tax revenue, increased density in an underutilized area. They talked about meeting housing needs. They talked about being good corporate citizens. They talked about the one incident that had resulted from the community engagement process, and they framed it as an outlier, one upset resident, they suggested, not representative of the actual community consensus. Margaret felt her jaw tighten when they said that. One upset resident, as if her breakdown had delegitimized the concerns rather than clarifying them. Then it was Margaret's turn. She stood at the podium, hands shaking slightly, and she looked out at the board members. Chairman Torres was watching her with neutral attention. Jessica Liu was making notes. Dale Patterson had a sympathetic expression. Susan Goldman was checking her watch, and Marcus Webb was already shaking his head slightly, as if he'd made up his mind before she'd even spoken. "My name is Margaret Chen," she began, "and I'm the woman from the viral video." She saw the slight relaxation in the room. Some people had wondered if she'd have the courage to acknowledge it directly. "I had what you could call a breakdown on a construction site 2 weeks ago," Margaret continued. "I was angry and upset, and I expressed that in a way that was emotional and uncontrolled. I'm not proud of that moment, but I am proud of what I've done since then." She gestured, and George clicked to the first slide in their presentation. "The development company claims they've followed all regulations," Margaret said, "but they have a pattern of violations. They missed 2 required notification windows specified in state law. Their noise mitigation plan doesn't comply with town ordinances, and their project scale was never actually approved for this zone. The current permits are for a different configuration." The slides moved through the documentation. Sound measurements, legal citations, comparative zoning information. The presentation was meticulous and devastating. "What happened to me on that construction site," Margaret said, "is that I realized I hadn't been heard. My concerns had been dismissed. The concerns of my community had been dismissed, and I broke under that pressure. But the pressure didn't come from nothing. It came from a real lack of process. It came from a real failure to follow legal requirements. It came from being ignored." She paused. "I'm not here to stop progress," Margaret said. "I'm here to demand that progress happens responsibly. That when a company wants to change a community, that community gets a real voice in the process. That regulations aren't just suggestions, that people matter." She stepped back from the podium. Then George presented the documentation. Marcus and Jen walked through the zoning violations. Patricia played the audio recordings of construction noise at hours that were in direct violation of town ordinances. Patricia Wu spoke about property impact. Linda Rothman, to Margaret's surprise, spoke about her initial skepticism of Margaret, but her growing realization that Margaret had been right. And other residents spoke too. Carol, who lived 2 houses down, talked about her baby not being able to sleep because of the noise. Henry, who had lived in Oak Ridge for 35 years, talked about watching his neighborhood change in ways that hadn't been subjected to proper community review. Even a few of the newer residents spoke. They weren't opposed to development, they said, but they were opposed to development that didn't follow the rules that were supposed to protect everyone. By the time the board members asked their questions, the dynamic had shifted noticeably. Chairman Torres was asking the development company's lawyer about the missed notification windows. Jessica Liu was pressing for clarification on the zoning violations. Even Susan Goldman had put down her phone and was paying attention. Marcus Webb was still shaking his head, but now he was in the minority, and everyone could see it. I move that we table this approval until the development company can provide evidence of compliance with all state and local notification requirements, and can present a modified project scope that aligns with the existing zoning parameters, Jessica Liu said. Second, Dale Patterson said immediately. There was a brief discussion. Chairman Torres, in his pragmatic way, pointed out that the development company could reapply with a modified proposal, so this wasn't necessarily a permanent stop. He was trying to find middle ground. Jessica and Dale pushed back. They wanted it on record that this particular proposal, as submitted, did not meet regulatory requirements. In the end, the vote was 4-1 in favor of the motion. Marcus Webb was the sole vote against. The development company's lawyer was already on his phone, texting someone, his face carefully neutral. The developers knew they could appeal this, could modify their proposal, could continue the fight. But they'd lost this round. They'd been stopped by following the rules, by presenting documentation, by building community support. They'd been stopped because someone had fought. When Margaret walked out of that meeting room, she was surrounded by people thanking her, wanting to shake her hand, wanting to say they believed in her. Some of them were people she'd never spoken to before this process. Some of them were neighbors who had originally been skeptical of her. But they'd listened, and they'd understood, and they'd supported. Lily found her in the hallway and hugged her, and Margaret held her daughter and felt tears on her face, but they weren't tears of breakdown this time. They were tears of something else. Relief, maybe, or validation, or the strange feeling of discovering that you had power you didn't know you had. Outside the town hall, reporters were waiting. Margaret had agreed to give a statement. She stood in the cool September evening with her daughter beside her and George and Marcus and Jen and Patricia and Linda behind her, and she spoke. Today, the zoning board voted to require proper regulatory compliance from the development company. That's not a victory against development. That's a victory for community process. That's a victory for the idea that people's voices matter, that regulations exist for a reason, and that progress doesn't have to come at the cost of ignoring the people it affects. And I want to say thank you to everyone who supported this effort. When I broke down 2 weeks ago, I thought I was finished. But instead, I got a second chance. I got a chance to be heard. And I've learned that when one person is truly heard, it creates space for others to be heard too. Later that night at home with David, after Lily had gone to bed, Margaret sat with her husband on their couch and allowed herself to feel the weight of what had happened. "I'm proud of you," David said. It was the second time in 2 weeks that someone had said that to her. "I'm proud of me too," Margaret said, and she realized that was the real victory, not the zoning board decision, though that was important. Not the viral redemption, though that was significant, but the fact that she could look at herself and feel pride instead of shame, that she could see herself as someone who fought instead of someone who broke, that she could see herself at all. But power has a price, and redemption has conditions. Margaret would learn this in the weeks that followed. The development company didn't quietly accept the zoning board's decision. Instead, they hired a team of lawyers and consultants, and they filed an appeal with the County Board of Supervisors. They also started a public relations campaign with targeted Facebook ads and local news interviews, emphasizing the economic benefits of the project and framing the opposition as NIMBYism from established residents trying to prevent housing development. Some of it was fair criticism. Margaret knew that. Not everyone in Oak Ridge's opposition was motivated purely by regulatory concerns. Some people, like Susan Goldman, though Margaret hadn't known this at the time, were indeed opposed to the development simply because it would change their neighborhood's character, which was code for they didn't want that kind of people moving in. The development company made that argument loudly and repeatedly. They hired a marketing firm that produced videos of affordable housing advocates expressing frustration with communities that blocked development, and then complained about housing shortages. It was a sophisticated strategy. Reframe the opposition as elitist, morally compromised, not actually interested in the community's good. And it worked on some people. Margaret started receiving emails. Some were supportive, but increasingly, she was hearing from people who felt betrayed by her opposition to development. You claim to care about community, but you're blocking 140 new housing units. That's not community-minded, that's selfish. Did you know there are families living in cars right now because they can't afford housing in this area? Your fight is preventing them from getting homes. You had your rant moment, now let the adults make decisions. One email came from a woman named Sophia, who identified herself as a housing rights activist. The email was long, detailed, and scathing. It pointed out that Margaret's opposition to the development was, in fact, a form of exclusionary zoning, that her focus on regulatory compliance was a thin veil for NIMBY attitudes, that by fighting this development, Margaret was literally contributing to a housing crisis that disproportionately affected poor people and people of color. Margaret read this email multiple times, and with each read, she felt something inside her shift from certainty toward doubt. Was she right? Was she really fighting for community? Or was she fighting to keep her neighborhood exactly as it was, exactly as it benefited her and people like her? She brought it up at one of the Tuesday night meetings. The response was mixed. George and Marcus and Jen saw the development company's complaint as a rhetorical strategy, a way to reframe the opposition as morally compromised. But Patricia Wu was quieter. Linda Rothman was uncomfortable. I mean, Patricia said carefully, we're not against housing. We're against this specific development as it was proposed. They can modify their proposal, meet the regulations, and we could support it. But Margaret wasn't sure that was true, and she wasn't sure if Patricia Wu was sure either. That night, Margaret called Sophia. The activist answered on the third ring, sounding surprised. I got your email, Margaret said, and I wanted to understand your perspective better. They talked for an hour. Sophia explained the housing crisis in California, the way that communities like Oak Ridge had, for decades, used zoning regulations and NIMBYism to prevent development and preserve property values at the expense of affordability. She talked about the disproportionate impact on communities of color and low-income families. She talked about how the rhetoric of regulatory compliance and community process had historically been used as covers for exclusion. And Margaret listened, and she couldn't argue with the facts. The housing crisis was real. Exclusionary zoning was real. Her neighborhood was predominantly white and upper-middle class, and the people who opposed development were, largely, the people who already had secure housing. But doesn't that mean we're not allowed to care about how development happens? Margaret asked. No, Sophia said. It means you have to do it honestly. You have to acknowledge that you care about your neighborhood and you care about people who need housing. And then you have to figure out how those two things can coexist. If you only care about regulatory compliance, that's just hiding behind process. After the call ended, Margaret sat in the dark of her living room and realized that she'd made a mistake. Or not a mistake exactly, but an incomplete truth. She had been right about the development company's regulatory failures. That was factual, documented, and important. But she also had been motivated, at least partly, by a desire to preserve her neighborhood in its current form. She had wanted things to stay the same. And in wanting things to stay the same, she had positioned herself against change, even change that might help people who needed it more than she did. On October 9th, at the Tuesday night meeting, Margaret said, I need to tell you all something. The group gathered in her living room, 20 people this time. George, Marcus, Jen, Patricia, Linda, and 17 others, her army of opposition, her community of fighters. I've been thinking about what we're fighting, Margaret said. And I think I've been lying to myself about it. We can say we're fighting for regulatory compliance, and that's true. But we're also fighting to keep our neighborhood exactly as it is. And I'm wondering if those two things are compatible with actually caring about community. She told them about Sophia's email, about the conversation, about the housing crisis. And she watched the reaction move across the room, some discomfort, some defensiveness, some genuine reconsidering. So what are you saying? George asked. That we should support the development. No, Margaret said, but I'm saying that we need to think about what we actually support, not just what we oppose, because opposing something isn't the same as having a vision for something better. Linda said quietly, so what's your vision? Margaret took a breath. She had been thinking about this since the call with Sophia. My vision, Margaret said slowly, is that the development company modifies their proposal, makes it bigger, not smaller, creates more housing units, including units that are affordable, actually follows the regulations and the notification requirements, and we support it. We fight for it, actually. We fight to make sure it's done responsibly and inclusively instead of the way it was originally proposed. There was silence in the room. That's quite different from what we've been doing, Marcus said. I know, Margaret said, and I'm not saying I have this figured out. I'm saying I was wrong about some things and I'm trying to correct course. Patricia Wu spoke up. I actually think that's smart, and honestly, the development company's property is their property. They get to develop it. We don't actually have the power to stop them forever, but we might have the power to shape what gets developed, to influence the terms. Over the next 2 hours, the group's strategy shifted. Instead of fighting the development, they would collaborate with it. They would ask for modifications that made it more inclusive, more community-oriented, more actually responsive to housing needs. They would demand that the company meet regulatory requirements and make positive contributions to the community. It was a more complex fight, but it was also a more honest one. When David came home that night and Margaret told him about the shift in strategy, he was quiet for a long time. Are you okay? He finally asked. I'm not sure, Margaret admitted. I feel like I've been righteous about this whole thing, like I've been the hero of my own story. And then I realized that being the hero of your own story and being honest aren't always the same thing. Do you regret the rant? David asked. Margaret considered this carefully. No, I needed to break to understand what was broken. But I think the break was the easy part. The hard part is what comes after. The part where I have to live with the complications and the contradictions and the fact that nothing is as simple as I want it to be. David took her hand. I've learned that about myself too, he said. That I don't have to have everything figured out, I just have to be honest about what I don't know. I started therapy, he continued. By the way, I've been going for 2 weeks. I didn't tell you because I wasn't sure if it would stick. And is it sticking? Margaret asked. Yeah, David said. It is, and the therapist asked me something that made me think about you. She asked, what are you afraid of? And I realized I was afraid of becoming invisible, not to other people, but to myself. I was so busy building this career, this life, this image of who I was supposed to be that I lost track of who I actually was. And then you had your breakdown, and I realized that's not an option for me. I can't break down. I don't know how to put myself back together the way you're learning to. You're not me, Margaret said. You don't have to break down, you just have to be honest. I'm trying, David said. And I think it's helping. I'm less angry at work. I'm home more. And I actually called my mother and told her I'd been thinking about what she said, about listening to your video. And we talked for an hour, actually talked. We haven't done that in probably 10 years. On October 15th, Margaret met with Patricia Way and the development company's lawyers. Patricia had asked if Margaret would be willing to meet with them to discuss potential modifications to the project. The meeting was held in a conference room at the law firm's office. The development company had brought the same people as before, the architect, the project manager, the lawyers, plus a new addition, a community affairs consultant named Jennifer, who had extensive experience with affordable housing advocacy. We've been paying attention to the discussion in the community, Jennifer said, and we realized that our original proposal didn't address housing affordability. We're open to modifying our approach. They presented a new plan, bigger than before, now 180 units instead of 140. Mixed-income housing, 30% of the units would be set at affordable rates for 10 years. Better community spaces, more parking to address traffic concerns. Actual community input sessions before the next zoning board presentation. It wasn't perfect, but it was substantively different. This is better, Margaret said, but I'd want to see actual numbers on the affordability components. And I'd want the community input sessions to happen before you finalize the design, not after. Those are reasonable requests, Jennifer said. And then, surprisingly, how would you feel about being on an advisory committee to help guide the project going forward? Margaret looked at Patricia Way, who gave a small nod. I'd have to check with the community, Margaret said. This isn't just my fight, it belongs to the people who have been supporting it. The community vote, taken at the next Tuesday meeting, was complicated. Some people felt like Margaret was abandoning the opposition. Some felt like she was actually following through on what opposition should be, pushing for better outcomes rather than just blocking things. In the end, 17 people voted yes, 6 voted no, and the rest abstained. "I'm going to do it," Margaret told the dissenting voices, "and I hope you'll understand why later, even if you don't understand now." She was learning that community wasn't about everyone agreeing. It was about people trying to do better, even when they didn't have perfect clarity. The next phase of the project took 6 months. Margaret served on the advisory committee, which met twice a month. She learned about construction timelines, zoning regulations, affordable housing programs, and the complicated negotiations between profit motive and community benefit. She learned that development wasn't evil, but neither was it automatically good. It was just powerful, and power needed accountability. The community input sessions happened. This time, Margaret made sure that the sessions were held at times when working people could attend, that childcare was provided, that translation services were available. The development company, to their credit, showed up genuinely interested in listening rather than just marketing. Margaret testified at the second zoning board meeting in favor of the modified project. She stood at the same podium where she'd stood months before, but this time she said, "I've learned that sometimes fighting for what you care about means being willing to change your position when you get new information. This development as modified is good for Oak Ridge. It adds housing. It includes affordable units. It was developed through real community process. I support it." The zoning board voted 5-0 to approve it. Construction began in April. It was still loud, still disruptive, but it was different. The development company had actually implemented noise mitigation measures, had scheduled construction to minimize impact during school hours, had a community liaison who responded to complaints within 24 hours. The project was completed in 18 months. 84 families moved into the affordable units. 92 units were market rate, purchased by a mix of first-time homebuyers and families looking to downsize. The community spaces included a garden area maintained by residents, a fitness center that offered free classes to neighborhood residents, a job training program run in partnership with a local nonprofit. On the day the project officially opened, Margaret stood in the courtyard with Patricia Way and watched people moving into their homes. A young woman in her 20s, with a toddler, was showing the child around their new apartment. An elderly couple was being escorted by their daughter to their new home on the ground floor. A group of teenagers were playing basketball on the new court. "You did this," Patricia said. "We did this," Margaret corrected. "All of us, the community. And actually, the development company did their part too. Once they decided to be collaborative instead of adversarial, they actually came up with a better project than what they'd originally proposed." Patricia laughed. "That's very diplomatic." "It's not diplomacy," Margaret said. "It's just complicated. The world is complicated. I spent a lot of my life trying to make it simple, either good or bad, right or wrong. And then I had a breakdown on camera and I learned that simple is easier than complicated, but it's not truer." The viral video became something different over time. New clips would circulate occasionally, sometimes with the comment that lady was right, sometimes with "this aged well," sometimes with just laughing emojis. But the original 47 seconds of Margaret's breakdown was no longer being used as a punchline. It had become a case study in restorative justice, in how communities can respond to conflict, in how people can grow. A small documentary was made about Oak Ridge and the development process. Margaret was interviewed, David was interviewed, George and Marcus and Jen and Patricia and Linda were interviewed. Even some of the development company employees were interviewed. The documentary showed the complexity. Nobody was purely good. Nobody was purely bad. Everyone was trying to do something reasonable within imperfect circumstances. It aired on a small streaming service and was seen by about 50,000 people. Most of them watched it and didn't think about it much afterward. But some people watched it and understood something that they'd been struggling with, the idea that you could be right about something and be wrong about something else at the same time. That redemption wasn't about becoming perfect, it was about becoming authentic. By the 2-year anniversary of the Rant, Margaret had become something of a small local celebrity. She was invited to speak at community panels about development and zoning. She was quoted in local news articles about housing policy. She was consulted by other communities dealing with similar issues. She also quit her job. It wasn't a planned decision. She'd been working in corporate HR for 15 years, a job that had felt safe and invisible, which had been exactly what she wanted. But after everything that had happened, invisibility no longer felt safe. It felt suffocating. She started her own consulting firm focused on community mediation and development process facilitation. It was scary and uncertain, and required her to be visible in ways she'd never been before. But it was also, for the first time in a long time, honest. David's career trajectory changed too. He'd finally had the conversation with his firm about wanting to work fewer hours. They'd offered him a partnership track that was designed for people who wanted work-life balance. It paid less than his previous trajectory, but it meant he was home for dinner most nights. He was there when Lily came home from school. He was present. Lily graduated high school and was accepted to UC Berkeley. She'd changed her college essay at the last minute to write about her mother's breakdown, not in a negative way, but as a moment of authenticity in a world that demands performance. The essay was honest and painful and beautiful. The admissions officer had written, "Thank you for showing us who you really are." On the 2-year anniversary, Margaret got a phone call. It was from Sophia, the housing rights activist who had sent her the challenging email. "I wanted to reach out," Sophia said, "because I watched the documentary and I wanted to apologize. I was harsh with you when we first talked." "You weren't wrong," Margaret said. "You were just seeing a part of the story that I wasn't willing to see about myself." "But you listened," Sophia said, "and you actually changed. Do you know how rare that is? Most people, especially people with the kind of privilege you have, just double down when they're challenged. But you listened and you changed and you built something better." "I learned from you," Margaret said, "and I think you're still right about a lot of things, about exclusionary zoning, about how communities use regulation as a cover for discrimination. But I also learned that it's more complicated than just oppose development or support development. The real work is in the nuance." "That's why I'm calling," Sophia said. "I'm starting a nonprofit focused on helping communities engage with development in ways that both protects existing residents and creates affordability. And I want you to be on the board." Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. An invitation, a validation, a sense of being called towards something. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I want to do that." The Sunday after the 2-year anniversary, Margaret's mother came to visit. They had lunch at the cafe in the new development. Ironic, they both noted, since this was where the rant had happened. Now the construction site had become a gathering place. "I'm proud of you," her mother said, for what must have been the 100th time since the viral video. But it never got old. Margaret had spent so much of her life not hearing that. "I'm proud of me too," Margaret said, "but I'm also exhausted sometimes, by all the things I learned I had to do, by all the ways I had to be wrong before I could be right." "That's what being human is," her mother said. "We're all just trying to figure it out as we go." They sat in the cafe courtyard in the afternoon sun and watched the neighborhood, the new part and the old part, the development and the established homes, the people who had always been there and the people who had just arrived. It wasn't perfect. There were still tensions, still conversations that needed to happen, still systems that needed fixing. 3 years after the viral rant, Margaret received an invitation to speak at a national urban planning conference. The title of her panel was "From Conflict to Collaboration: How Communities Can Engage with Development." She was sitting in her home office, preparing her notes, when the video appeared again. Someone had found it and remixed it with footage from the completed development project. 47 seconds of her angry, broken face, immediately followed by clips of families moving in, kids playing, the community garden thriving, the job training center helping people into employment. The remix went viral again, but it was different this time. The comments weren't mocking, they were thoughtful. "I love this timeline where someone breaks down and then actually does something about it. More people should have emotional breakdowns and then become community organizers. This is what accountability and growth actually looks like." She went from Karen to community leader. That's a full circle moment. Margaret watched it with a strange combination of emotions. The first time the video had gone viral, it had felt like an exposure of her failure, her weakness, her inability to hold herself together. Now it felt like evidence of her humanity. She called her mother. "Have you seen the remix?" Margaret asked. "Oh my God, yes," her mother said. "I've watched it 5 times. I've already sent it to my book club. Margaret, look at what you've done. Look at how far you've come." I thought I was supposed to be over this, Margaret said. Over needing validation, over caring what people think. You are over needing it, her mother said, but that doesn't mean it doesn't feel good to receive it. That night, Margaret walked through the development. It was now a place she moved through freely without defensiveness. She nodded to residents she recognized. She stopped at the garden where a group of teenagers were harvesting vegetables for the food bank program. She paused at the job training center, visible through the windows, where people were learning new skills. At one point, a woman approached her, someone in her 30s who Margaret didn't recognize. "Excuse me," the woman said. "Are you Margaret Chen?" "I am," Margaret said carefully. "I live here," the woman said, gesturing toward the development, "in one of the affordable units, and I just wanted to say thank you. When I was looking for an apartment, everything was so expensive. I was going to have to move away from my job, away from my community. And then this development opened and I could afford to stay. And I know that's because you fought for something better, so thank you." Margaret felt tears on her face. She reached out and hugged this woman who was a stranger but also not a stranger, another person in the world, finding their way just like everyone else. "Thank you for being here," Margaret said. "Thank you for letting me be part of that." At the National Urban Planning Conference, Margaret delivered her keynote address to a room of 300 urban planners, community developers, activists, and policymakers. She started with the rant. She showed the video. And the room went quiet. They recognized it, had seen it go viral, had been wondering who this woman was. Then she told the whole story. The breakdown, the fight, the realization that she was both right and wrong, the journey toward collaboration, the development that was actually better than what was originally proposed, the families who now had homes. "I started from a place of fear," Margaret told them. "Fear that my world was changing, that I was losing control, that something was being done to me without my consent. And from that fear I acted. But I acted in a way that was both authentic and limited. I was angry and I was heard. But I could have chosen to stay angry, to turn that anger into permanent opposition. Instead, I chose to listen to people who disagreed with me. And I learned something that I think is essential for people in my position to understand. Listening to criticism doesn't mean you lose your power. It means you get to use it more effectively." She told them about the advisory committee, the modifications to the project, the collaboration that made something better than either side could have created alone. "Communities aren't monoliths," Margaret said. "They're networks of people with different needs, different values, different fears. Development isn't inherently bad, and opposition to development isn't inherently good. What matters is process. What matters is whether everyone involved is actually heard. What matters is whether we're solving problems for the whole community or just protecting the comfortable existing community." The speech was well received. Margaret was approached afterward by dozens of people wanting to talk to her, to learn from her, to bring her to their communities to facilitate similar processes. But the moment she was proudest of came from a young woman who approached her afterward, with that familiar intensity of someone who has been struggling with something and just heard someone articulate it. "I did something similar," the young woman said. "In my neighborhood, I was blocking a development and I thought I was a hero fighting a villain. But then I realized I was fighting against housing, against change, against other people's dreams. And I felt so ashamed. I just wanted to say thank you for showing me that I'm not a bad person for having been wrong. I'm just a person who learned something." Margaret took the woman's hand. "You're going to do good things," Margaret said. "Anyone who can learn that quickly, that thoroughly, that humbly, that person is going to make a positive difference in the world." In the months after the conference, Margaret's consulting firm grew. She worked with communities in California, in Oregon, in Washington, in New York, in Chicago. Each community was different development issues, different conflicts, different fears. But the core principle remained the same. Listen, stay authentic, look for the third option where both sides can get something they actually need. Not every project worked out as successfully as Oak Ridge. Some broke down into genuine conflict. Some communities weren't ready to collaborate. Some development companies weren't interested in actually serving community needs. But Margaret learned to accept those failures as part of the process rather than evidence of personal inadequacy. She learned that she could be right and wrong simultaneously, that she could care about something and still need to change her mind. That power wasn't something you had or didn't have. It was something you exercised through visibility, through voice, through the willingness to be changed by new information. 5 years after the viral rant, Margaret and David renewed their vows. Not because anything had been wrong with their original wedding, but because they wanted to mark the fact that they'd become different people and were choosing each other again, consciously, with their eyes open. They held the ceremony in the courtyard of the development that had started everything. Among the guests were George, Marcus and Jen, Patricia and Linda. There was Patricia Way. There was Sophia. There was the woman who had thanked her in the development. Lily, now in college, read a poem she'd written about the strength it takes to break and the courage it takes to reassemble yourself differently. At the reception, an older woman approached Margaret. She introduced herself as Linda's mother. "I just wanted to thank you," the woman said, "for changing my daughter's mind. Linda used to be very rigid about things, about neighborhoods, about development, about who belonged where. And then she got involved with your project, and I watched her grow. I watched her become more compassionate, more nuanced. And I want you to know that that ripples. The fact that you changed, and that Linda changed because of you, and now she's changing other people, that matters." Margaret thought about the infinite ripples of change. How one person's breakdown could lead to another person's growth, which could lead to another person's transformation, which could lead to how many people, years from now, making better choices because some woman in Oak Ridge had finally allowed herself to not be fine. On the 10th anniversary of the viral rant, Margaret was invited to a reunion. The community of Oak Ridge wanted to celebrate the project, gather the people who had been involved, mark the moment. Margaret walked through the development that morning before the event. 10 years, the buildings had weathered slightly, gained character, the gardens had matured. The people who had moved in 10 years ago had built lives here. Some had moved away. Others had deepened their roots. New people had arrived. At the gym, she ran into a young woman who had been a child when the development opened, who now was a teenager. "Ms. Chen," the girl said, I think I know who you are. My parents said you had something to do with me being able to stay in Oak Ridge. They said without you, we would have had to move away." Margaret knelt down to the girl's eye level. "Your parents had to do the work of living here," Margaret said. "But yes, I helped make sure that option was available to them. And I'm glad you're here. It's people like you that make this place what it is." That night at the community reunion, Margaret was given a plaque. It read, "To Margaret Chen, in recognition of her commitment to community collaboration and growth." She held it and felt something she hadn't expected. Not pride exactly, but peace. The sense that she had tried her best, that she had gotten better along the way, that she had contributed something meaningful to the world. When they asked her to say a few words, she stood in front of the crowd. All these people whose lives had been touched by this process, who had fought together or learned together or changed together, and she told them the truth. 10 years ago, I had a breakdown. I was pushed past my limit and I broke down in public and it was filmed and I was humiliated. And I thought that was the worst thing that could happen to me, but I was wrong. That breakdown was one of the best things that ever happened to me because it made me real. It made me visible. And once I was visible, I had to decide, would I stay broken or would I rebuild? And if I rebuilt, who would I rebuild into? She paused, looking around at the faces of her community. I chose to rebuild into someone who listens, someone who's willing to be wrong, someone who knows that the world is more complicated than I want it to be, and that's okay. And that choice, the choice to rebuild into that person, has given me a life that's so much richer than what I had before. So if you're out there and you've had your own breakdown, your own moment where the mask fell off and you were exposed, I want you to know that that's not the end of your story. That's the beginning. That's where real growth starts. Sometime after the reunion, Margaret returned home. David was waiting for her, as he always was, present, attentive, real in the way he'd learned to be. "How was it?" he asked. "Good," Margaret said. "Meaningful, strange to see how everything has played out." They sat on their porch together, watching the sun set over Oak Ridge. The neighborhood was different now than it had been 10 years ago. But it was also the same, still trees, still people, still the simple miracle of a community trying to live together. "Do you ever regret it?" David asked. "The rant, any of it?" Margaret considered this carefully. "No," she said finally. "I regret the pain it caused. I regret that Lily had to deal with bullying because of it. But I don't regret becoming who I needed to become to have that breakdown, and I don't regret the person I've become afterward. That woman in the video, the one who was so broken, she was necessary. She had to exist for me to learn what I needed to learn." "And what did you learn?" David asked. Margaret thought about the viral video, the rant, the fight, the collaboration, the redemption. She thought about the families who had homes because she'd fought and then changed. She thought about her daughter, now in college, more authentic and brave because she'd seen her mother be authentic and brave first. She thought about her marriage, deeper and realer than it had ever been. She thought about the woman she'd become, visible, vulnerable, powerful, human. I learned, Margaret said, that breaking doesn't have to be the end, that sometimes breaking is the beginning, and that the whole world changes when you're willing to be honest about how broken you are. The sun set, the neighborhood grew quiet, and somewhere in that quiet, in the gathered darkness of ending day, a new beginning was already starting.